Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm really glad to be back to the Philosophy Club and to get a chance to talk to you about some stuff, and I want to fully represent myself as what I am and own up to the mistakes that I've made. I used to be a libertarian, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry. And I mean that part jokingly and part seriously. I can be convincing. And if there are arguments to be found for a position that I think is true, I'll probably find them, and I'll probably try to convince you that the position is correct if you'll sit still and listen to me. And so, thankfully, I stopped being a libertarian before any of you made it to CU, so I don't think my poisonous influence affected any of you. But I want to just give a general I'm sorry to the universe because I was wrong. Libertarianism is the purest form of American capitalism, and capitalism is the dominant ideology in the United States. This is just a fact about how we think in the United States. It has a whole bunch of contingent historical causes, but capitalism has won in the United States. And I'm calling it an ideology because it's more than just an economic system. It's a way of thinking about value and about our relationships with each other and about how what ultimately matters can be gotten by us and why that matters. Capitalist ideology has us non-consciously view and interpret all interactions with the world, with other people, and with ourselves through that dominant ideology of capitalism. This would be the case for whatever the dominant ideology was, but it just so happens to be capitalism. Capitalism is the law of the ideological land, and so it functions the way that any ideology would, by getting itself into our brains and having us interpret the world in terms of it. And by non-consciously there, I mean it's not an interpretive tool so much as a lens through which we view the world. And this is just something about ideology that you will know if you've ever studied any sociology or social psychology. The fact that something seems obvious to you within an ideology or is common sense within an ideology is not on its own evidence for the truth of that thing. So those of us who have done a little bit of ideology study cringe every time we hear somebody propose common sense gun regulations, common sense regulations on whatever. That just says we're going to be doing more of the same thing that we're already doing, which is great if what we're already doing is succeeding. It's not awesome if what we're already doing is failing. So we're being controlled. And we're being controlled by the dominant ideology, but the dominant ideology services one group of people over everybody else. And that group of people is the powerful. Libertarianism, the purest form of the dominant ideology of capitalism, does not benefit the powerless. That's just a fact about how it works. Libertarianism convinces us, you and me, that we are free while stealing resources from the poor and giving them to the rich. It's Robin Hood running backwards. Libertarianism is a contingent game that's made to feel necessary. We don't have to be libertarians. We don't have to be capitalists, but we are because, as I've said, capitalism has won, and whenever an ideology wins, it's made to seem natural to us. Insofar as we continue to play the game of libertarianism, or of capitalism more broadly, you and I lose, and they win. Now, you might not like to hear that. Libertarianism might tell you something different from that. I'm going to prove to you why what it says is incorrect. But remember, just because libertarianism says, no, that's not true, doesn't mean I'm wrong. Any ideology would say, no, that's not true when attacked. So we should expect this from libertarianism. Now, I've named the talk Confessions of a Recovering Libertarian, because I'm no longer a libertarian, but that recovering language I've chosen self-consciously, because in this ideological way, libertarianism is a sort of disease that embeds itself in our brains and steals life from us. It takes resources It takes wealth, it takes time, it takes, if you want to use Marx's language, part of our species being, and gives it to somebody else, all while convincing us that everything is fine. So I'm going to tell you about myself. I can't talk about everybody. I'm going to tell you about my beliefs and my path to and then away from libertarianism. But libertarians, I don't know if this is to their credit, are surprisingly intellectually homogeneous. They believe the same things for the same reason. So my analysis of myself here is also a critique of libertarianism as a whole, can be generalized to all libertarians. And so the claim that I'm making that I was wrong can be generalized to libertarianism is false, and any libertarian who still exists out there is also wrong and should listen to me. I'm going to give you just 3 definitions to set things up here. These are the only really technical definitions that we need to remember throughout the talk, and then I'll be building on these throughout the talk. The first is this position of libertarianism. Libertarianism is a conservative political position holding that negative individual freedom is of singular, paramount importance. Singular here meaning there aren't any other things that are important in this way, and paramount meaning that there's nothing at this level of importance. The most important and only most important thing is negative individual freedom. Well, what's that? Negative freedom is a concept of freedom, a view of freedom, a picture of freedom, a story about what freedom is, in which a person is free in direct proportion to the amount of non-interference from others. Insofar as you're not messing with me, I'm free. The more you don't mess with me, the more free I am. And I've talked about individual negative freedom here. That's a specific type of negative freedom that relies on a picture of individualism. Individualism is a metaphysical, epistemological, and moral position holding that individual rational human persons, things like you and me, are the atomized ground of knowledge and moral facts, meaning that we are at the level of fundamental reality independent of each other. One of us could exist and the other ones could all go out of existence and nothing would change for that individual. All the stuff that you know is knowable by you independent of the existence of anybody else. And all of the most important moral facts, the ones that ground all of the other moral facts, come into existence because of you, the individual. Here are a few implications of those 3 definitions, and these are the things that you'll see more when people describe libertarianism. They'll give you these implications. First implication, societies are nothing but collections of individuals. The moral facts within societies are simply collections of the moral facts applying to those individual citizens. It would have to be this way if individual people like you and me are just atomized things. So when you get a bunch of us together and you call it a society, it is nothing more than a group of individuals. No new moral properties come into existence that aren't just constructions out of the old moral properties. Any government or state should be as small as possible and should only protect the negative freedom of its citizens in terms of securing private property, guaranteeing contracts, and protecting against violent coercion. This is violent coercion within a society and from outside. So the police or the army or the National Guard, these are all protecting against violent coercion. And economies should be laissez-faire capitalist, and foreign policy should be non-interventionist. These are the bullet points that you might see on a Welcome to Libertarianism brochure. I'm going to talk just a little bit about private property here. Private property is of the utmost importance practically and theoretically to the libertarian. Practically, in terms of practice, how we're actually living, our lives become structured around collecting and protecting private property, and theoretically, individual rights are usually described by libertarians in terms of property rights. This is a really interesting way of talking that comes to seem natural to you if you hang around libertarians or you are a libertarian. For example, murder and rape They're bad because a person's body is her own private property. That's the story there. So we don't need to make sense of the badness of murder and rape outside of property rights in terms of something like respect or pleasure or the teleology of humans. We can just make sense of the badness of all bad things in terms of private property. For example, the reason that we shouldn't subjugate the historically subjugated, private property rights. The subjugation of people of color or women or members of the LGBTQ community is bad because in some way it's a violation of their private property rights. I've been calling this position a conservative position, which might have struck some libertarians as a little bit odd. Isn't libertarianism, you might ask, fiscally conservative? Sure, but socially liberal. Well, here's the reason why I'm using the word conservative. A conservative political position is a political position that attempts to conserve or revive a past way of organizing society. Libertarianism is similar to the classical liberalism of John Locke and John Stuart Mill. Lots of Johns are libertarians. Because of that, we have this old political position starting 400 years ago or so, and that political position is essentially the birth of libertarianism, although by another name. So this is conservative in that libertarians are trying to conserve this old way of thinking about individuals and their relation to each other or their relation to society. People who are normally called conservatives, at least in the United States, contemporary Republicans, are conservative in some ways, although they're not conservative in other ways, which we'll talk about momentarily here. But Republicans are not conservative across the board. Let me tell you about myself, how I became a libertarian. I grew up a Democrat in a Democratic family, concerned generally with social issues. I think I could understand by age 8 or so that enslaving people or treating people poorly based on ways that they identify was a bad thing. Economic policy, that took me a little later to understand, maybe till 9 or 10. So my understanding of social issues was through the dominant conception of those social issues, the lens of liberal individualism, this individualist picture that dates back to Mill and Locke. Liberal individualism, though, is inconsistent with any collectivist public good projects present in democratic fiscal policy. So, for example, a welfare state or Medicare or Medicaid. Those are inconsistent with this liberal individualist picture. So in order to maintain ideological consistency, I adopted a liberal individualist fiscal policy to match my liberal individualist social policy. And the liberal individualist fiscal policy is laissez-faire capitalism, a sort of free market, unregulated or as unregulated as possible capitalism. But also, if I'm being honest, I wanted to look very smart, and libertarianism promised that I could look really smart. I don't know if you've ever hung around a libertarian, but we like to tell you how very smart we are and how if you don't understand libertarianism, it's either because you're dumb or you're not thinking hard enough about it. And to a certain extent, that's right, and then to a better extent, it's not. But, you know, I'm a white man who wants to have people praise him. And so I became a libertarian. It's not confusing that I would do that sociologically. Now, to further the point that I was just making about ideological consistency, that liberal individualist point, it actually requires libertarianism. If you're a liberal individualist and you want to be consistent, you have to be a libertarian, which is how I ended up being a libertarian. This means that both contemporary Democrats and contemporary Republicans hold internally contradictory political positions. They're equally internally contradictory, so you can, if you just need to be one or the other of them, you can just pick the one that repulses you the least. But they're both contradictory positions. The Democrat will say, we are required to respect every person's individual moral rights to the extent that almost no promised collective social benefit could override the social half of those rights. But when we're thinking about the fiscal half of those rights, economies should be heavily regulated for the sake of the collective good. That is not consistent. And similarly, the Republican will say, we are required to respect every person's individual moral rights to the extent that almost no promised collective economic benefit could override the economic half of those rights. But when it comes to social life, we should heavily regulate that for the sake of collective goods. But both of those, as you see, are internally inconsistent. And if you want to be this sort of liberal individualist, if you want to be part of this tradition that dates back to Locke, then you can't be either of these. You've got to be a libertarian. Now, there are some issues with libertarianism, especially in terms of the practical consequences of capitalism. The consequences of capitalism when capitalism is made to work in the actual world. And most libertarians don't like those consequences very much. Most libertarians aren't celebrating those consequences. And so we have to excuse them somehow, or attempt to justify them, or pretend that they're not that big a deal. Here's how I did it. Capitalism has a practical history that's one of depredation, exploitation, and maintaining existing power structures. I'm not saying this is built into the definition of capitalism. I'm just saying when you wind capitalism up and let it go, that's what it does. Now that's undeniable. And if you want to pretend that that's not the way that capitalism works, you can, but you are ignorant of history. Here's how you can get around the problems. You can say, well, libertarianism is not a consequentialistic position. Libertarianism is a position that's concerned with rights. Rights can't be overridden by consequences. For example, it doesn't matter how many of you hate me for saying words that are protected by the Constitution. Your hatred doesn't override my constitutional right to say words that you hate. So since libertarianism is not a consequentialistic position, no matter what awful things happen in society as a result of capitalism, libertarianism should be unfazed. Just an aside, I was always really confused by the editors of Reason magazine, which is the #1 libertarian publication that I subscribed to for a number of years, when they would try to lie about the history or the practical effects of libertarianism and claim that capitalism was actually doing great all over the world. You don't see sweatshops. That's not what's actually happening. I thought that there was a much easier way out of this that didn't involve lying and intellectual dishonesty, which was just say, rights matter, consequences don't. So I would say, yeah, capitalism is contingently morally very inefficient, but economically it's really efficient, and it's the only acceptable option. So I would draw this distinction between the morally good and the economically good and say, maybe it's morally bad, but if you're trying to figure out what reasons you have for adopting an economic system, screw morality. And I would also add, if people don't like the contingent moral inefficiency of capitalism, they can always make better market choices. If you don't like that Nike uses sweatshops, that Apple works their workers so horribly that they jump out of windows to kill themselves, if you don't like that, stop buying those products, I would say. And then my ideology started to break. Here's how. I actually learned some history. I learned the history of capitalism and of capitalism in the United States. I read a whole bunch of social psychology, and I learned how ideology functions in terms of social psychology, how it can make the world seem a certain way even when it's not that way. I learned that in the United States, in Western universities and in what's called business school in Western universities, economics, which should be an evaluation and analysis of economic systems, just gets confused with cheerleading for capitalism. And so if any of you have taken lots of business classes, you'll probably know that what you learn is how markets function. Very rarely do you look at challenges to the entire system of market capitalism. And if you had a professor who taught you how to not just cheerlead for capitalism, that is awesome. You should give that person a high five and a bag of Swedish fish. I read Marx. I know. But you can't just believe the story that's told by your ideology that Marx is a stupid, dumb idiot and he was hiding his stupidity in that beard. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about, and so I read him, along with a whole bunch of later Marxists, especially people like Adorno and Horkheimer. And then, as I was teaching Robert Nozick, I started to actually listen to the words that were coming out of my mouth. And as I was teaching Nozick, I thought, there's an issue here that if I had just paid attention, I would have recognized before. I'll come back to Nozick just momentarily. These weren't just intellectual cracks in the dam, there were also emotional cracks in the dam. I realized that libertarianism isn't radical, it's not revolutionary, it's not contrarian, it's not cool, it's just sticking up for the establishment. And this is a very weird component of libertarian ideology, is that it sells itself to young people as the cool new hip thing that all the kids are doing these days and that the adults don't like. It's not. Libertarianism makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. There's nothing contrarian or revolutionary about that. That's just how economics has worked always. I saw that historically subjugated people, people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ community, etc., that I had wanted to be helping, that got me to libertarianism to begin with, were made worse off by libertarianism. And so if libertarianism was my way to make things better off for the historically subjugated, and when you wind libertarianism up and then set it loose, it makes the historically subjugated worse off, that's a problem. And I came to be able emotionally to accept that libertarianism is intellectually simplistic. There's not all that much going on intellectually with libertarianism. Once you understand what negative freedom is, you just apply that over and over in every situation, and there's a ready-made response to everything. So I wasn't even being all that smart by being a libertarian, and since I still had this need to be thought of as smart, I needed to find what the smart position was, and it wasn't libertarianism. And this one really bothered me. I watched my fellow libertarians one at a time move further and further to the right, which wasn't something that we were supposed to do. And I watched them become racists and sexists and full of hate, and some of them even became fascistic. And this made me think, uh-oh, did I buy a ticket to something that is a form of fascism and not realize it? Now, I don't think that libertarianism on its own is a form of fascism, but it might be a gateway drug if all of the people who are smoking it are becoming fascists. So you want to worry about what the people around you who believe the same thing that you do are doing. Now, it might be the case that they're all confused and you're the only one who has the true theory, or it might be the case that you are being used. Let's talk about Robert Nozick for a second. Because like I said, when I was teaching this, I started to listen to what I was saying. Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, it's a 1974 book, is libertarian scripture. You should memorize Anarchy, State, and Utopia if you are a libertarian. I went to a libertarian conference one time where Milton Friedman's son, David, was speaking, and people all brought their copies of Anarchy, State, and Utopia. I didn't have mine, and I felt left out. Just a little bit about Nozick. Nozick has this theory of distributive justice. Distributive justice is the issue of morality when applied to who owns what in a population. And his theory holds that the results of uncoerced property transfers, so if I take something and give it to somebody else, or they take something and give it to some further person, so long as those transfers aren't coerced, you know, someone takes out a gun and says, do it, then the results are morally just, so long as you started from a way that the property is arranged that's morally just. So if you have a good holding, meaning how the stuff is arranged, and you follow good rules, you get out a good holding. Nozick actually says that he was trying to base this on how valid deductive arguments work. You take a true thing, you follow valid inference forms, and then you get a true thing out of it. But if you've got garbage, you take something that is unjust. It doesn't matter how many uncoerced property transfers you go through, you still get to an unjust conclusion. So for example, if I steal one of your computers and then uncoercedly somebody takes it from me and then they give it to somebody else uncoercedly and they give it to somebody else, when you go to that final person and say, could I have my computer back, please? They can't say, nope, it went through 17 transactions. That is your computer. It was stolen from you. Now, here's the issue. Since about the 1400s in the United States, there have been no morally acceptable property distributions because the United States came into existence and was perpetuated for a long time via theft and murder and genocide. And this is actual genocide. You people are the wrong race, so we're going to kill you all. And up till the mid-1800s, there was legal and government-promoted owning of people in the United States, so not that long ago. So according to Nozick, none of the resultant property holdings are legitimate, which means that according to libertarian scripture, everything is wrong. There's a problem if your Bible says that your God doesn't exist. There's an even further problem here that I always just try to sweep under the rug. I knew about this problem right at the beginning of being a libertarian. I didn't know how to deal with it, but smart people were libertarians, so they probably knew how to deal with it. There's this theory of property acquisition in Nozick called the Lockean Proviso. If you want to take something that's unowned and start to own it, then as long as you leave enough and as good for anybody else who might want some, that thing belongs to you now. Why in the world that is the case is totally unclear, and nobody has ever been able to explain to anybody who's asked the question why that should be the criterion for property acquisition, but there it is. So how you come to own property, remember that property is the fundamental moral thing for the libertarian. How you even come to get it in the first place is unjustified. It's ad hoc. And more than that, it would also result in nobody ever being able to own property ever, because anybody else who might want to own some property doesn't just include the people who exist right now, it includes the people who will exist out till the end of time. And if you try to consider whether somebody's going to want to own the thing that you are trying to own out till the end of time, the answer is going to be yes. At some point, somebody's going to want to own it. So according to Nozick, not only are we not allowed to have the stuff we have right now, but nobody's ever allowed to acquire property to begin with. And that's the libertarian scripture. This is worrisome. Once I recognized that that was going on in my theoretical foundations of libertarianism, I started to recognize that I was very confused in a whole bunch of other areas as well. And I'm putting this in terms of me because I really was very confused, and I'm still trying to escape that confusion. But remember, I'm also talking about contemporary libertarians. Some libertarian dogma, although not most of it. Some of it relies on just outright lies. For example, that libertarianism is the only theory that respects individuals, false and ridiculous. Or that capitalism is the best economic theory for lifting people out of poverty. That is not true either. But by and large, libertarianism does not support itself via lies. It supports itself by getting its adherents, libertarians, to believe that there are no other conceivable options. And once you think that there are no other conceivable options, then all debates about the economic system or the ideology occur from within the economic system or the ideology. So there's no possibility of overturning something if the thing that you might try to overturn is a precondition for discussion to begin with. And that's what I thought, that there was no other option. And I thought that because libertarianism made me blind to alternate theories and alternate explanations. I just wasn't able to see them, literally wasn't able to see them, because that's how ideology works. Now, one thing I hadn't considered was demographics. Libertarians in the United States are overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly college-educated, and overwhelmingly wealthy. That's either because rich, white, college-educated men are much better at discovering the truth than everybody else is, or it's because something about libertarianism and its consequences appeals to that demographic. So can we honestly claim, I started to realize, that libertarianism protects and promotes the interests of the historically subjugated if that's what the demographics of libertarianism are? Further, I had seriously misunderstood freedom. This is the concept of freedom, what freedom is. When somebody says that freedom is important, what they're even talking about. Now, libertarian ideology defines freedom negatively, as we've seen, and it blocks the intellectual possibility of considering other conceptions of freedom. So much so that if you're a libertarian and somebody gives you an alternative conception of freedom, your knee-jerk response will be to say, you're defining words wrong, let's move on. I know this because I did this. So here's a question for you. Anna and Ben are both traveling. They're on the same plane to visit friends in California, although they don't know each other. Both made the decision to make the trip, and neither one of them is being threatened or coerced. Which one of them is more free? It seems to me that they're about equally free, because they're both doing the same thing. They're both participating in the same activity. Now, according to the Libertarian, it doesn't matter what they're doing. It matters what they're being prevented from doing. And we can't tell, given what's going on here, whether they're free or not. If Ben had the ability to go on the plane and paid for the ticket and is going, and Anna had the ability to buy her own plane and somebody took that money from her and she has to go on this plane, Anna is substantially less free than Ben is. But that just doesn't seem like what freedom is. Let me give you another one. Carol and Daniel both want to travel to visit friends in California. Everybody has friends in California. Carol will die of an easily preventable cause. Daniel is going to make it to California. Who's more free? Seems to me that Daniel is more free. Daniel can go to California and Carol can't. According to the Libertarian, you have no idea. You have to know who's being prevented from doing what their natural capacities are, and how those natural capacities are being interfered with. Now, it's not incoherent to think of freedom in that way, but it's weird. Once we think about how we naturally think about freedom as an ability to do stuff, the Libertarian merely negative picture of freedom seems at worst unjustified, at best ad hoc. So you can stomp your foot here and say, no, damn it, that's what freedom is. Justifying why that's what freedom is rather than the thing that really seems like freedom, that's going to be difficult for you. Further, I hadn't understood what choice is. I thought I knew what choice was, but I did not. Libertarian ideology defines choice in terms of intentional, direct, violent coercion by another person. So you are making a free choice so long as some other person hasn't intentionally, directly, violently coerced you to do that thing. And just as in the freedom case, libertarianism blocks off the intellectual possibility of considering other conceptions of choice, to the point where, and I know this because I did this, if somebody says, I'm not sure that's what a free choice is, you'll say, you don't know how words are defined. Here's a question for you. A man is drowning in a pond, and you could throw him a life preserver that for some reason you are carrying around with you. It's not going to get damaged. You don't need it. You can have it back afterwards. So you say to him, hey, man, let's call him John since there's so many Johns in this discussion. Hey, John, if you agree to work for me for the rest of your life for minimum wage, I'll throw you this life preserver. And John says, yes, I am drowning. Is that a free choice on John's part? According to libertarianism, yes. It's as free as any other choice because you didn't throw him into the pond. Now, the analogy here, if it's not clear, is that the vast majority of people out there in the world, real people, would die without work. The only thing they own is their ability to work. They, in libertarian terms, freely choose to work for a company that exploits them by stealing much of the value of their labor. That is clearly not a free choice. If libertarians define freedom in that way, something is wrong. The fact that you didn't put people into that position doesn't mean that your exploitation of the position that people are in is morally fine because it's a free choice. I think we all know this. Here's another thing I hadn't understood. Libertarian ideology defines profit, the thing that's made by companies, as the result of free choices, creation of value, and mutual benefit within a market, and it blocks the intellectual possibility of considering other evaluations of profit. Now, that's what libertarianism says. In reality, though, this is what profit is. The owners of capital pay workers less than their labor is worth and sell the products or the services that they make from that labor for more than those products or services are worth. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any profit. Profit is the, quote, excess value that actually belongs to the workers and the consumers. And if you're like, wait a minute, I don't think you understand how markets work, I'm getting there. So if my labor is worth X amount of dollars and you pay me less than X amount of dollars so that you can take the extra stuff, you have made profit, but you've exploited me. And a company wouldn't exist if it didn't make profit. So don't think, oh, well, you know, all those great companies that don't exploit their workers, not a thing. When profit is made, it's always paid to the owners of capital. This is always an upward redistribution of resources from the already poor to the already wealthy. The people who own capital are wealthy, by definition. They're the people who make the profit in a company. They make profit on the backs of the people who have to work for them because they don't have any other choice. So there's always this upward redistribution, which is why the claim that lots of people make that capitalism has the best ability to lift people out of poverty is such a bizarre claim. By definition, capitalism steals from the poor and gives to the rich. So it's unclear what that claim means. Yeah, maybe I misunderstood economic value. Let's talk about economic value for a second, because when somebody would say what was on the previous slide to me, I would say, you're just redefining value. You don't understand what value is. Libertarian ideology defines value as a result of market choices and mutual benefit. Value is created in markets. Everybody goes in with a certain amount of value and more value comes out. It's better than a perpetual motion machine. Libertarianism blocks the intellectual possibility of considering other conceptions of value, and that is how it justifies profit making. Profit is created in markets. It's not stolen. Capital is the ability to have future work done for you. The owner of capital possesses, when they possess capital, a promise of future work. If they couldn't get anybody to work for them, then they wouldn't have capital. Same way as you wouldn't have a dollar if no store would take it. That thing stops being a dollar. The value of that work, though, is determined by its ability to generate more capital. This is just what capitalism is. There's one and only one valuable thing, capital, and capital is valuable insofar as it's able to generate more capital for the owner of the capital. Capital is thus merely instrumentally valuable, meaning valuable in terms of what it can get you, in terms of its ability to bring about more of itself. It asexually reproduces. But no theory of value contains merely instrumental value. So those of you who have taken any ethics classes or value theory classes know that value is only valuable if it's ultimately grounded in what's known as intrinsic value. If A is valuable because it can bring about B, and B is valuable because it can bring about C, and C is valuable because it can bring about D, unless you get to a point where something is valuable not because of its ability to bring about something further, but just in itself, then you've got a chain of things that are valueless. Capitalism, however, says that's exactly what value is. It's an ungrounded chain of instrumentally valuable stuff. But even more than that, and just obviously, these claims about value that capitalism makes are false. There are clearly things that are valuable outside of capital, like friends or family, or if you're a Kantian like me, respect, or if you're a utilitarian like people who are wrong, pleasure, or autonomy, or love, or food, or medicine, or clothing, or housing, or education. These things are all clearly valuable. According to capitalism, no, they're not. Something has gone wrong here. I hadn't understood private property either. The fundamental thing, and I hadn't understood what it was. So libertarian ideology defines private property as stuff that is yours to use, and it blocks the intellectual possibility of considering other conceptions of private property. But this is a conflation of two different concepts. The concept of private property on the one hand, and the concept of personal property on the other hand. Both private and personal property are yours to use. So what's the difference between these? Let me tell you about private property. Private property isn't actually about you. It's about everybody else. For something to be private property is for it to be morally legitimate for the owner of that private property to violently prevent other people from using it. Private property is legitimate exclusionary license. So my car is my private property. If you try to get into my car and take it and I kill you, I'm allowed to do that. I mean, maybe that's extreme. Beat you up, I'm allowed to do that because it's my private property. It legitimates violent exclusion. But here's a question. What could possibly justify the violent exclusion of anything that a person claims private property ownership over? Why could you possibly be allowed to beat somebody up just because the thing that you've put your flag in and said, mine, is something that that person is trying to use? Now resist the urge here to say, it's your private property, damn it. We're asking why that is morally legitimate. Even further, think if the person needed it to live and you've already got 40 of them, what would justify you killing that person for trying to get that stuff? Libertarianism says it's because it's your private property. I hadn't understood resources. Libertarian ideology conflates resources with capital. It says they're the same thing, and then it reduces all of it to capital. And it blocks the intellectual possibility of considering other conceptions of resources. But capital is socially constructed. If people will work for you, you've got capital. If they won't, you don't. Resources, they're not socially constructed. Something is a resource independent of what anybody thinks about it. The only reason for resources to be related to capital is so that the rich can extract labor from the poor in exchange for the resources. The poor are kept poor so that the rich can profit off of them. So why would I have to pay for medicine when somebody else has it and doesn't need it? Something about markets, but that explanation only works if resources are the same thing as capital, which they are not. Reorganizing the distribution of resources will harm the rich while saving the lives of hundreds of millions of poor people. You can't do that with capital. So if you ever talk about reorganizing the distribution of resources with a libertarian or a laissez-faire capitalist, they'll say, you can't do that, that's not how markets work. No, you can't redistribute capital because that's not how markets work. If you take all of the food and you distribute it better, it's not as though the food disappears. The capital would, because it wouldn't be as valuable anymore, but food doesn't stop being valuable because you reorganize its distribution. And here is the most embarrassing one for a self-professed ethicist. I didn't think about ethics. Libertarianism holds that there is only one moral value, negative rights. And that's usually cashed out, as we've talked about, in terms of property rights. But none of the prominent moral theories, that's Aristotelianism, Kantianism, utilitarianism, and the ethics of care, support such a picture. The closest you can get is Kantianism, but Kantianism says that the reason why you need to not steal stuff from people rights-wise is because people have rights. That's as close as you can get. On all of those pictures, ethics is about people. It's not about the possession of property. There's this libertarian obsession with making everything about property, and it results in ethical demands about the basicness of negative rights that are themselves ethically unsupportable. Now, of course, you could just stomp your foot and say, this is my ethical theory, I've got no good reason why we should buy this one rather than any other one. If that's your position, I reject it. And notice that the libertarian can't get out of this by saying, ethics, let's not care about that, because the entire system is based on an ethical claim about what it is morally right to do with private property. Those are a whole bunch of things that I was confused about. And then I went searching for the root of the disease that had infected me and given me all of these horrible symptoms. Here's what I found. Libertarianism couldn't function without our acceptance of capitalism, obviously. Capitalism couldn't function without our acceptance of liberal individualism, our thought that we're these atomized things that interact with each other merely by choice, but have no moral or epistemic or metaphysical relations with each other. And liberal individualism couldn't function without our acceptance of this thing that's known as the just world theory. The just world theory says that anybody who has something morally deserves it, and anybody who doesn't have something morally deserves not having it. We wouldn't accept the liberal individualist picture of our relations with each other unless we accepted that the distribution of stuff in the world was already correct. But it's clearly not. Anybody should say that. And so here's what I realized. There are more of us than them. We do their work for them, we fight their wars for them, we protect them while they sleep. So we're doing this to ourselves. We could stop, but because we buy the just world theory, we allow for our own exploitation. And so I've been looking for a cure for myself. Here are the beginnings of it. One thing that I've got to do is recognize that it is false that human lives are structured around zero-sum competition, distrust, fear, and domination. No, they aren't. You can force people to be like that by taking away all of their stuff and then saying the one who lives is the one who beats the other ones up. But people are not naturally like that. I also want to recognize that the fundamental forms of human organization, families, friendships, educational relationships, are structured reciprocally, not transactionally. So I do something for my mother because I know that my mother would do something for me if I needed it. But even if she wouldn't do it, that wouldn't have made me a fool for doing it for her. Or I come here and I teach you not because I'm getting paid, but because I know you would do it for me, and I expect you to do it for other people out there. I need to recognize that group promotion of the good is necessary for real freedom. I need to recognize that the freedom that's worth caring about is the sort of thing that requires all of us looking out for each other, instead of just not messing with any one individual person. And I need to recognize that that true positive freedom is necessary for the flourishing of individuals. If you just take away roadblocks to people's lives, the people who will have good lives are the people who are already having good lives, and the people who will have bad lives are the people who are already having bad lives. It's like if there are two cars and one of them has no gas and one of them has a full tank, and you take the parking brakes off and you go equally free. So that's the beginnings of my cure, and here are my next steps for myself. Ideology was in my own way, and I'm ashamed of it. And once I corrected my own ideology, I got better. And now I'm required not just to sit in a classroom and think, but to act in whatever way I can act best. One of those ways will be talking to others, so doing this sort of thing. And so by talking to people, I can make things better. I can make at least one of you uncomfortable that you're being deceived by an ideology. I can put this whole theory that I've got now into practice. It requires me organizing with other people because this whole theory that I've got going on now says that collections of people are the primary units in a society, not individuals. So I've got to regain the collective spirit that I lost because of libertarian atomization. I've got to remove governmental support for capitalism. I need to elect politicians who have similarly been freed from the ideology of capitalism. And we don't have an anti-capitalist party in the United States, but we can if we want one. And I need to reclaim as much as I can and work with others to reclaim as much as we all can what is ours. We need to take back resources and refuse to be held hostage simply because we were born without all the capital and other people were born with all the capital. And so said more simply, our future can be better than our past, and they aren't going to make it easy for us. Because remember, they're getting rich off of not making it easy for us. But there are more of us than them. Lots more of us than them. And we deserve better than what they've given us. Thanks a lot.